and thank you for joining our Teach-In for the 21st Century webinar brought to you by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang. I am your host, Annie Cyrus. And tonight we have a very, very special guest. He is Ben Weingarten. He's a fellow at the Claremont Institute, also a senior contributor to the Federalist. He is the author of the new book, American Ingrate, Ilhan Omar and Progressive-Islamist Takeover of the Democratic Party. Ben, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Not a problem, and thanks so much for having me, Annie.
Of course, and we are very, very excited to hear all your thoughts on this very important topic. So, floor is yours.
Thanks so much. And allow me to begin by thanking the Freedom Center for hosting this event and its invaluable efforts in any number of realms. And I want to thank you, Annie, for moderating tonight's discussion. A core theme of this book, American Ingrate, is the perpetual battle between liberty and tyranny. The former is the exception to the rule in the history of human affairs, and the latter always seeks to take advantage of liberty to achieve dominance, whether in the case of the global jihadist movement, as we'll discuss tonight, or the Chinese Communist Party, which has forced us to meet under these conditions. On the point of liberty versus tyranny, I want to raise a few relevant stories that have transpired during this pandemic. The first is that the nominee for president for the Democratic Party, at least until he's pulled at the last second perhaps, Joe Biden, said he shared a common vision with socialist Bernie Sanders. That's rather significant. Sanders proceeded to endorse Biden, and the two agreed to work together on certain policy matters. Biden lavished praise on Sanders, saying, and I quote, "You've been the most powerful voice for a fair and more just America. You don't get enough credit, Bernie, for being the voice that forces us to take a hard look in the mirror." Unquote. Congressional Progressive Caucus co-chair Pramila Jayapal later joined Sanders recently in backing Biden, and she said, and I quote, that she was ready to work with him to craft and then implement the most progressive agenda of any candidate in history. This completely lays waste to the notion that Biden, by the way, is the moderate candidate. The second major item is that the Democratic Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, sought to cynically use the prior rounds and will probably use future rounds of so-called coronavirus relief legislation to pass a raft of radically leftist measures having nothing to do with getting America back on its feet from, again, a communist China created but essentially government-induced economic coma. And the third item is that Ilhan Omar has led the charge, along with Bernie Sanders, for whom she served as campaign co-chair in the all-important 2020 state of Minnesota, in a de facto Iranian malocracy-led information operation to seek to also cynically use the coronavirus crisis to lift sanctions in the most strategically significant and lucrative sectors of Iran's economy. This would provide a lifeline, of course, to that despotic, America-hating regime, which is today tottering. That is, one of Ilhan Omar's main priorities during this pandemic was the health and well-being of the Khomeinists, tyranny personified. She's serving as an unregistered foreign agent for totalitarians with the blood of thousands of innocents, including Americans, on their hands, and that has been at war with America since 1979. Omar was not alone. True to form, given candidate Biden's pronouncements on his commonalities with Bernie Sanders, he too seemed to endorse the idea of lifting sanctions on Iran, along with establishmentarian par excellence, Senator Dianne Feinstein. And as for Speaker Pelosi, the major force advocating for using the coronavirus crisis to pass this litany of radically leftist measures was the party's progressive wing, led by, among others, Ilhan Omar. And again, that effort continues apace. Omar's support of socialism at home and surrender abroad is not only an invitation for tyranny, but a promoter of it. That invitation for and promotion of tyranny is rooted in a belief in America's inherent evil, and that social justice requires turning our purportedly evil values, principles, and institutions on their heads. Social justice itself, of course, turns the concept of justice on its head, a fundamental value of America. It perverts that concept, for justice needs no modifier. These sentiments increasingly dominate the Democrat Party, illustrated by Congresswoman Omar's rise. And that is the first of three major points that I wish to make this evening and that I expound upon in great detail in my book, American Ingrate. So let me restate that first one clearly. The Democratic Party is increasingly the party of Bernie Sanders and Ilhan Omar. Biden may be the front man, but it's Sanders and Omar's party now and in the future. And as I will address momentarily, the party's shift on Jews and the Jewish state, which is core to its philosophy of multiculturalism and politics of identity, is an essential piece of evidence for this. American Ingrate argues that Ilhan Omar's meteoric rise from Somalia to a Kenyan refugee camp to Minnesota community organizer to state representative and then to the pinnacle of power as a congresswoman on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, authoring a battery of bills that Ben Rhodes calls the new progressive baseline for foreign policy, and able to act with total impunity, having stared down Nancy Pelosi several times and won, parallels that of her party's leftward trajectory. We see it reflected in just how far left the Democratic presidential field had been and continues to be under Biden. We see it reflected in the fact that in her right mind, Speaker Pelosi and many establishment Democrats, including committee chairmen like Gerald Nadler and Eliot Engel, would have never supported the impeachment charade had the squad not existed. Why? The squad posed a threat to the establishment's political power, maybe an existential threat to it. We see it reflected in the fact that the Congressional Progressive Caucus has grown in membership 16-fold in a generation, from just 6 members when it was founded in the early 1990s, led by Bernie Sanders, to today with just under 100 members, comprising more than 40% of the Democrat majority in the House. And we see it, as I explore at great length in the book, in what I refer to as the wokeification of our illiberal elites, who disproportionately influence the Democratic Party and sit atop our institutions, not just as government bureaucrats, but in the academy, media, popular culture, and in the boardrooms of the businesses that comprise woke capital across the country. So this is not the Democratic Party of JFK or Scoop Jackson or Daniel Patrick Moynihan or even Bill Clinton. It would be unrecognizable to most of them. The Democratic Party is increasingly dominated by progressivism and progressives, and Ilhan Omar both symbolizes this progressive rise and is a leader of it in her own right, having amassed substantial power at a dramatic clip. And as I argue in the book, Congresswoman Omar's efforts to advance a fundamentally subversive, intersectional, and identity politics-based agenda geared towards destroying our fundamental institutions under the guise of social justice reveal a deep-seated contempt for her adopted homeland and serve as a direct attack on it. She is the tip of a very poisonous spear, elevated by a party that increasingly celebrates said intersectionalism, identity politics, and virtue signaling through America bashing, the essential parts of the Ilhan Omar persona. And that brings me to my second point, which is that as the Democrat Party has gone leftward, like its woke, elite, illiberal cadre, it has embraced Jew hatred. On this point, I must commend you to a piece in the Claremont Review of Books by Bill Vogelay, which I cite liberally in the book, titled The Chosen and the Woke, from the summer 2019 edition of the CRB. The party's embrace of Ilhan Omar represents its embrace and legitimization of this Jew hatred, which serves as a proxy for its embrace and legitimization of tyranny. Historically, where we find Jew hatred, we typically find tyranny, whether of the communist or Nazi variety. Therefore, the Jews and the Jewish state represent a particularly important litmus test for free and just societies because they are the canary in the coal mine for freedom and justice, real justice. As I put it in the book with respect to anti-Zionism, it's not solely that seeking to undermine and delegitimize Israel, a nation representing the first line of defense of Western civilization against Islamist tyranny with shared values, principles, and interests, is decidedly antithetical to America's interests. It's that hatred of the Jewish state is indistinguishable from, and indeed a mask for, hatred of the Jewish people and their values, which are foundational to Judeo-Christian Western values and Western civilization itself. That is, hatred of Jews is a proxy for hatred of all traditional Americans who hold dear our founding principles. This is why Rep. Omar's views and the left's willingness to kowtow to her over them transcend matters of individual bigotry or international relations, but at their root concern the perpetual struggle between civilization and barbarism. Jew hatred, often masquerading as hatred of the Jewish state in the post-Holocaust era, is the glue that holds the burgeoning intersectional Progressive-Islamist alliance together, of the Corbynite variety across the pond and the Sanders-Omar variety here at home. And let's hope the Sanders-Omar variety here at home, by the way, gets crushed like the Corbynite one did. It's what allows our woke progressives to try to justify the kind of Holocaust inversion whereby Jews are labeled white supremacists, cast as sitting atop the privilege pyramid, rendering them the ultimate victimizers rather than the ultimate victims. There are historical roots to this, as I chronicle in the book. Jew hatred was an essential part of socialism from its earliest incarnations in the 19th century and has predominated in the Islamic world since the advent of the religion. It continued as this alliance between the international left and the Islamic supremacist world coalesced during the Cold War, and it manifests itself today in the person of Ilhan Omar. As I argue in American Ingrate, Ilhan Omar sits at the center of this intersectional alliance and is one of, if not its key leaders. She's the ideological heir, as I detail, of not just her self-described heroes like Angela Davis, but the likes of Edward Said, Yasser Arafat, and their comrades in arms. Though the original sin for the Democrats with respect to Omar and the ideology she represents may have been Speaker Pelosi's putting Omar on the House Foreign Affairs Committee in a bid to curry favor with progressives, the red line moment was the party's unwillingness to censure Ilhan Omar's anti-Semitic remarks on the dual loyalty canard and the so-called Israel lobby. Let me point out on this latter point that while Omar was talking about AIPAC, as I note in the book, it was J Street, an organization that Omar has supported, and by the way, which Biden has accepted the endorsement of, that contributed more money than any other Israel-focused group during the 2018 midterm election cycle. 98% of its campaign funds went to the Congresswoman's fellow Democrats. Let me also point out, and I spend a full chapter on this point in the book, that Barack Obama paved the way for Ilhan Omar, yet he's never gotten his due for it. You can trace in Obama the legitimization of radical leftism and Islamic supremacism, and the shift in the Overton window of positions in the Democratic Party on related issues that enabled someone like Ilhan Omar to become a viable national candidate. Let me also point out that in the book, I present an argument I think many of you will find compelling, that Democrats are effectively trading Jewish votes for Muslim votes. And lastly, let me also highlight that while the left talks about a scourge of white supremacist anti-Semitism in this country, the most visible manifestations of Jew hatred today concern attacks on Orthodox Jews, the only politically conservative sect of Jews, primarily residing in deep blue locales and perpetrated by those in deep blue locales. I ask, can we separate the atmosphere in which these crimes are committed from the rise of this progressive Islamist alliance? Returning to the main point, however, Jew hatred is an essential part of the intersectionalist philosophy to which Omar and her fellow progressives subscribe and the politics of identity that they practice. In fact, I would say that Omar, in many respects, is a living, breathing manifestation of multiculturalism, or the multiculturalist worldview. That is, in opposition to a unifying American culture, whereby peoples of all different backgrounds assimilate over shared values and principles, rooted in Athens and Jerusalem, not Mogadishu. It's bad enough that a party not only condones, but has embraced an Ilhan Omar who passes Natan Sharansky's 3D test for anti-Semitism with flying colors, which goes beyond her rhetoric or embrace of the jihad-tied, genocidal BDS movement. And by the way, how can you support a group that wants to destroy the Jewish state and say you don't hate Jews? And who seems determined to act out every example of anti-Semitism as laid out in our State Department's own definition of it. But it becomes a literal danger to American life and limb when one considers that Omar supports the policies of, takes money from, and consorts with like-minded Islamist, terror-tied entities, foreign and domestic, that seek to undermine the great Satan of America and the little Satan in Israel. And this brings me to my third and final point. Ilhan Omar's radical views, her poisonous rhetoric, and her corruption, both in terms of unethical and almost certainly criminal personal behavior, masks the fact that she literally poses a national security threat to the American people. That security threat concerns her collusion with adversaries, foreign and domestic. On the foreign side, in the book, I apply the Mueller special counsel mandate and detail extensive links, ties, and/or coordination, primarily between Omar and the Erdogan regime in Turkey and the Somali regime under Farmajo. On the domestic side, we see it most prominently in Omar speaking in front of, supporting the policies of, and receiving remuneration and campaign contributions from the likes of CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, unindicted co-conspirator in the then largest terrorist financing case in U.S. history, and a number of other Muslim Brotherhood-linked organizations and individuals that put America last and Islamists first. On account of her allegedly criminal personal behavior and verifiable ethical lapses and corruption alone, I suggest that Omar would never be able to get the most basic of security clearances were she applying for them. Throw in her collusion with these adversaries, and it's absolutely chilling to consider the threat to our national security of Ilhan Omar sitting on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, privy to our most sensitive intelligence and information. In closing, I wrote this book because a country cannot long survive when a party representing half of the public is consumed by an ethos of national self-loathing. The truth about Ilhan Omar must be brought to light if we're to have any chance of preventing tomorrow there being 10 or 20 or 50 Omars in Congress. It's an existential threat to the entire Judeo-Christian West. That, as I show in discussing the unexplored roots of Omar's ideology and agenda in the book, her worldview could have just as easily been picked up in the Marxist-Islamist dystopia where she grew up, privileged in Mogadishu, as in her adopted home in Minneapolis, should terrify every American. I also wrote this book to expose the nature of the progressive political adversary and provide arguments to refute them, in particular on the matter of free speech. Political correctness, which serves as a sort of social prior restraint on speech in legal parlance, is the enforcement arm of progressivism. On this last point, I wrote this book to proffer the argument and hopefully encourage others to follow suit, as those associated with the Freedom Center have done, that we must speak openly, honestly, and boldly, without hysterics, but with strength, about the threat posed by Ilhan Omar and her acolytes. They raise the argument of Islamophobia to try and shut down any and all dissenting opinion. Progressives, of course, frequently engage in projection when they claim their critics are bigots when they're presented with legitimate criticism. In fact, Ilhan Omar's campaign rushed to put out a fundraising letter within hours after American Ingrate was released, which I take as a compliment. That letter read in part, I'll quote from it, "A right-wing extremist just dedicated a racist, Islamophobic book to bashing Ilhan." Note, by the way, the incorrect grammar here. I have to say we're blessed at times to have political adversaries like these. But joking aside, that letter was no laughing matter. It goes on to say, and I quote from it, "The author is attacking Ilhan with Islamophobic hate speech in his book to rile up the far right, turn more people away from bold progressive ideas, and incite violence against her." Let me just say, I wrote the book to expose people exactly to these so-called bold progressive ideas. But the charge of incitement to violence is a remarkable one and a very serious one. It's a clear attempt to chill free speech, and it represents an attempt to impose, incidentally, a de facto Sharia speech code. As many of you may know, Islamic law does not abide free speech. And if one uses language critical of Islam, one is liable to be warned against using such hate speech in Western parlance under threat of punishment up to and including physical violence and death. Whether grounded in Sharia or leftist concepts of hate speech totally antithetical to the Western view of speech, the fact of the matter is that it would be Islamophobic not to subject Ilhan Omar and her so-called sisters, like Linda Sarsour and Rashida Tlaib, to the very same level of scrutiny as we do all public figures. Ironically, the people speaking out against Omar in particular over her allegedly criminal, scandalous, personal behavior, which I devote a chapter to in the book, are actually Somali American Muslims. So I have to ask, are they all Islamophobic bigots too? Are they trying to incite violence, or are they actually the victims of violence? There's sufficient evidence to suggest that they are under threat for speaking openly and honestly about her. But more importantly, those forming this progressive Islamist alliance seek to use victimhood and claims of bigotry to silence and stifle us, and as a shield to protect themselves from competition in the war of ideas. We have to hold on to our concept of the First Amendment with all of our strength and exercise it liberally, because once we lose that right, we lose all of our other rights too. The tyrannical crybabies on the other side cannot abide free speech. We must speak ever more freely for liberty and justice, the great exceptions again throughout the history of mankind, if we hope to triumph over this generation's battle with tyranny at home and abroad. I greatly appreciate your sharing your time to hear a bit about my book, American Ingrate, which I hope you'll pick up and will serve as a companion for you during this time of self-quarantining, social distancing, and hopefully reflection. And if you feel so compelled on the basis of these remarks, I hope you'll pick up copies for your children, grandchildren, and friends, because this book concerns existential matters for America and Western civilization itself. So with that, I thank you, and I look forward to taking some questions.
Wow. Amazing information with a scary topic. So thank you. Thank you so much, Ben, for sharing this information with us. And before I get started on questions, I would like to ask the first question myself. It's a simple question. Many people ask it. I haven't really heard a decent answer to it yet. So here's the question. Where and or whom created the term Islamophobia, and for what purpose was it created?
Yeah, there have been a number of reports done on this, and there's some conflicting information. There is evidence to suggest that a progressive think tank in the West picked up the concept of Islamophobia, and also that there are Muslim Brotherhood-tied individuals or organizations that themselves also promulgated this concept of Islamophobia. I think more important than the root of it, although I think it is quite telling that it appears to be progressives and Islamists that both mutually kind of agreed to the use of this concept, is the fact that the incorporation of Islamophobia is something that has been pushed at the UN and other global governmental institutions. And that has been pushed primarily by Muslim countries as well as progressives as a means of stifling any free speech that treats Islam just like any other religion in terms of critique of it. So I think where it originated is a valuable exercise, and it appears that there are both Islamist roots and also progressive roots. But maybe the most important thing is the fact that Western countries themselves have incorporated, and not the US, thankfully, but many other countries in the West have incorporated concepts of Islamophobia and hate speech into their constitutions as a means of basically self-censoring citizens in what should be a bastion of free speech, free discourse, and free ideas that is the West.
Well, thank you for that answer. Let me go ahead and read the first question from our audience. The question says, why do the voters choose so many progressive? Is the main cause the media, the school, the economy, or something else?
I'd say primarily a combination of the first two. The media and the schools are the main areas at an increasing rate of socialization, of effectively indoctrination. As our viewers out there are likely aware, the progressives have had a long march through the institutions of higher education, and it's trickled down to K through 12 and even before K through 12. In some cases, it's been a very smart strategy. They've executed it quite well over the decades. And in an America where increasingly you have children being born out of wedlock, where are people going to form their ideas as children? Well, schools are a huge indoctrinating force. And then, of course, media and pop culture is another pervasive influence in people's lives. So I think if you're a kid today in America, you are constantly faced, almost universally, no matter where you live, with an onslaught of progressive narratives. So why should we expect that conservative candidates are going to win one day out of the year every couple of years when from the time people are 5 years old or younger, they're constantly bombarded with a progressive narrative? I think when you add to that the fact that now you do have corporate America, for example, further pushing these sorts of narratives, it just becomes almost impossible to rebel against it. And I think what's quite remarkable, actually, is how successful on a relative basis Republicans and conservatives are given that onslaught. But I think it's a testament to the fact that the facts of life themselves prove to be conservative. And the further along people get in life, the further they realize what the reality is, and that the progressive reality is truly a dystopia that shows no resemblance to what the real world is actually like.
Wow. And some of these, all these children are going to build our future, right? Some of them are going to even make their way to the office and be part of our government.
Absolutely.
Okay, next question says, please comment on the failure of the Jewish members of the House Committee on Foreign Relations to confront Pelosi on the appointee of Omar to the committee. Their ongoing failure to speak out against it, the failure to use withholding of donations by many Jews.
Yeah, well, I think this is something that that actually extends beyond just a failure on the part of Jewish members of that HFAC, including Eliot Engel, who chairs it, but it really extends to all Democrats on that committee for not as strongly as possible opposing her being tabbed to that position. Now, with respect to Engel, I will say that it was particularly sad to watch him essentially cave to Congresswoman Omar, not only in terms of being admitted to that committee, but also later on as all of her anti-Semitic rhetoric started to filter out. While originally he was critical of her, ultimately he fell in line along with Speaker Pelosi and the rest of the Democratic establishment, did not call for censuring her by name, as I noted in that sort of red line moment where there could have been a resolution that explicitly condemned her and explicitly condemned her anti-Semitic remarks. Instead, it became a watered-down resolution, didn't name her, essentially castigated all so-called hate speech, and it really showed that she could get a free pass. And so what I would suggest is you have to ask the question, why did Congressman Engel cave on that issue and several other issues? And what I would suggest is Ilhan Omar has real power in the party. The progressives have real power in the party. And Engel, like many establishment Democrats, is facing primary challenges from those backed by groups like the ones that support AOC, Omar, Tlaib, and the rest of the squad. So why do I think Democrats have responded the way they have, establishment Democrats, including Jewish Democrats who oppose Omar on any number of issues? I think the answer is they fear for their political survival. And as a consequence, they've reacted in what I can only describe as a cowardly and shameful fashion.
I'm actually glad you brought up the squad, because the next question says, how optimistic are you about the 2020 election? Are we now just stuck with Ilhan Omar and the squad in power?
Well, I can report a little news that is somewhat positive with respect to the Omar seat. I don't hold a lot of confidence that she is really going to lose in a primary challenge. Our viewers are probably aware of this, but she represents a district that is Democrat plus 26. That is, a Democrat is a lock for that district now and forever, probably. And as our viewers also may know, this was Keith Ellison's seat before it was Ilhan Omar's seat, and that really tells you all you need to know about the nature of that congressional district. What I will say is she's facing a serious enough challenge from several DFL party members, which is the Democratic Party effectively in the state of Minnesota, including one in particular that's gotten a lot of press, and he's taken a much more measured tone by Democrat standards with respect to Jews and Israel. You know, basically he talks a good game about the need to defend our ally and partner in Israel. You know, of course, he advocates for a two-state solution with all the standard kind of establishment rhetoric that's always used around this historically by Democrats. So he presents himself as opposing Ilhan Omar's anti-Semitic rhetoric, as hurting the Jewish constituency that exists as a small minority in that district. And the reason I think that she's taking his threat to her seat seriously is that Omar, remarkably in recent days, actually signed on to an AIPAC-sponsored letter calling for the extension of a UN embargo on arms for Iran. So why would she ever sign on to an AIPAC-sponsored letter that might actually keep weapons out of the hands of the Iranian malocracy? The only reason that I can think of is that she feels serious political heat, that her opponents would seize on it if she didn't sign on to a letter like that. So do I think she made that decision on a principled basis? Of course not. I think it's a purely political one. But on the positive side, maybe we should take that as a sign that these challengers to her are quite serious. And then I'll also say, and this is more optimistic than anything else, but do I think that she will be subjected to real justice for what appears to be the raft of criminality in which she's been engaged? No, I don't. But all of that said, the fact that we had the DOJ today come out and dismiss the case, call for dismissing a case against General Mike Flynn, I think does indicate that maybe we should have at least a modicum of hope, of optimism for the fact that our justice system will actually work. I don't really hold out a lot of hope for it in the case of Ilhan Omar. I think the voters will be the only ones to mete out justice in her case. Hopefully one of these primary challengers does so. Not that I think they'll be significantly better than her, but it's not a very high bar to have to clear.
Let me ask you a personal question, or my own question. You brought up Ilhan Omar in Iran, which is my motherland. But here's another Islamic country Ilhan Omar is very close to, very connected. I would say even personal ally of, is Turkey with Erdogan. What does she gain out of that? What is the connection there between Ilhan Omar and Turkey and Erdogan?
Well, this question is a most interesting one. And I think to back up and provide a little bit of context here, when Ilhan Omar was a state representative in Minnesota in 2017, she came to New York and visited with Erdogan on the sideline of the UN General Assembly that year. That in and of itself is a remarkable thing. A state representative from a district in Minneapolis, in the Minneapolis area, that has nothing to do with U.S. foreign relations, really, nothing to do with Turkey. Why is the head of state of a country like Turkey meeting with Ilhan Omar? And so as I show in the book, and as I also write in an article in the New York Post that's published soon after the book came out as well, that I'd urge your viewers to take a look at, it appears that Turkey and Ilhan Omar have a sort of mutually beneficial relationship. They've cultivated substantial ties. Turkish media, for example, puts out dozens and dozens of pro-Omar pieces. She's met numerous times with officials beyond Erdogan from the Turkish government. She's visited Turkey before, and she actually bashed America while she was over in Turkey one time, which is typically a no-no in the history of American politics. I believe that Turkey has been cultivating a relationship with her, but she has also been more than open to that relationship, in part because they want to have influence over members of Congress. Turkey also has very substantial bilateral relations with Omar's native Somalia. And I think that is, in large part, one of the reasons why they feel such a kinship. Omar has, in tweets and other measures, basically praised Turkey for their help with some of the humanitarian crises that have been dealt with in her homeland over the years. Turkey has substantial economic investment in Somalia. Turkey also does has military ties to the Somali regime as well. And Ilhan Omar is quite close to that Somali regime, which is another part of the collusion chapter of my book. And I go into great length in terms of the nature of those relationships that she has as the highest levels. So I think in large part, it's a mutually beneficial relationship. What does Turkey get out of it? Well, for example, Ilhan Omar, when it came to a resolution that recognized the Armenian genocide as being propagated by the Ottoman Empire, or perpetrated, by the Ottoman Empire, she voted present. She would not vote and affirm a resolution that put the Armenian genocide at the feet of Turkey. That's remarkable. She was, I believe, the only member not to affirm that resolution. She has also essentially called for not sanctioning Turkey with respect to some of its acts. So I think they get a favorable vote in Congress on certain issues that are valuable to them. And she feels a kinship with Turkey. This is my interpretation because of Turkey's substantial ties with her native Somalia, which she views as a very positive development.
Fantastic. So I'm not all paranoid thinking that we have this refugee who never assimilated, only promoting her motherland, which is all about Islam, representing America.
Yeah, one of the most maddening things about her, and the reason why ingrate is such a fitting term, is that, and I explore this in great detail in the book, this is someone who has lived something beyond the American dream. I mean, she went from civil war torn Somalia to Kenyan refugee camps for 4 years, comes over to America, and then she ends up on this miraculous rise where before she's 40 years old, she's sitting at the pinnacle of power in the U.S. House on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. She should kiss the ground that she walks on every single day, but instead she spits on it. And you have to ask why. And as I hypothesized in the book, I suggest in a large part it's because her family was privileged in Somalia. And I think her ties, by the way, to the highest levels of the regime in Somalia indicate the fact that her family was of some standing there. And what evidence do I have for the fact that her family was prominent in Somalia? Well, first of all, and she said this, she grew up privileged. She lived in a compound in Mogadishu where she talks about having enough extra food that they could feed the beggars that stood outside their grounds, where she had books, music, quality education. She describes her family as her grandfather, who was a huge influence on her politically, was the director of marine transport in Somalia, and her father was a teacher's trainer. I have to understand what those positions entailed. This is a Somalia which was under the Siad Barre regime. Barre ran a Marxist Islamist dictatorship. He took over in a coup in the 60s, and he reigned there until 1991 when a civil war occurred and they fell out of power. And that's also when Omar's family had to flee. Why did they have to flee? Well, in part because I would suggest they were aligned with the Barre regime. They did well under that regime. And her father, by the way, in being a teacher's trainer, have to understand, in a Marxist regime, a teacher's trainer is one who indoctrinates other teachers to indoctrinate other people in the regime's governing philosophy. And again, that philosophy was Marxist Islamist philosophy. And that's not me describing it that way. That's actually how it was described in New York Times article that I cite from, I believe, the 70s or 80s on the nature of that regime. So why does she harbor such ill will towards America in spite of the fact that America has given her everything when she came from nothing? I think it's because her family prospered under that Marxist Islamist regime. And she still holds many of the same values that that regime sought to inculcate in people, and again, under which her family flourished.
Oh, well, as I said, Ben, I could ask you at least another 100 questions, but we only have time for a few left. So let me ask you the next question by our audience. It says, why do so many Jews in Hollywood hate Israel, especially when it comes to the threat of Sharia?
Well, unfortunately, sort of like with the angle question before, I think it extends even beyond Hollywood. And what it really comes down to is something that you see reflected in Bernie Sanders. You know, in the past, Bernie Sanders, when he was running for high office, running for president in 2012, for example, really didn't talk about his Judaism, his faith. This time he sought to embrace his faith and run on that basis. I should say, in 2016, he did not really embrace it. Now he does. And why does he embrace it now? Well, when you see him describe what his religion means to him, he describes it in leftist terms. He essentially equates Judaism with leftism, with so-called social justice, with all of these progressive principles. And there's a concept in Judaism that some viewers may be familiar with of tikkun olam, which has been perverted to suggest that healing the world in the sense of imposing leftist policies is what Judaism is all about. That philosophy, I'm sorry to say, prevails across not just Reform Jews, but also many conservative Jewish institutions as well. And Reform and conservative Jews make up the vast majority of all Jews in America. As I noted in my prepared remarks, Orthodox Jews, which are a very small fraction of American Jews, are the only politically conservative sect of Jews. So the simple answer that I would suggest is that for all too many Jews, and especially Jews who are not particularly deeply religious, leftism is synonymous with Judaism for them. And so as a consequence, they take up causes that ultimately represent anti-Israel causes and anti-Western causes at their very core.
Okay, here's our last question, not related to Muslims nor Jews, but the question says, will the new Facebook speech censorship panel be a progressive nightmare for us all?
I guess the question I would ask is, do you see any evidence that it won't end up that way? And I noticed that one of the panelists who's serving on this sort of speech committee, and by the way, if you need a speech committee, you've probably already lost, was Pamela Karlan. Pamela Karlan, as many of you probably know, was one of the people who was a panelist during the impeachment proceedings that the Democrats called to talk about the process of impeachment and why it's legitimate. And she was, of course, a Trump derangement syndrome fanatic, crazed anti-Trumper. If someone like that is sitting on the board, I think it tells you all you need to know about the way it's going to break. And unfortunately, Silicon Valley, which should be a force for the proliferation of ideas, a free and open marketplace of ideas and open discourse, ultimately is acting much more like the people who run the Great Firewall in China. That is, they don't want to permit competing ideas to engage with their ideas because ultimately they want power and control. They want to impose their philosophy on all of us. So again, I think the fact that there is even an advent of such a speech committee speaks volumes about what big tech is going to do to try to stomp us all out.
Of course, as I said, I could ask so many questions. Hopefully I get a chance to do them another time. But for now, thank you so much, Ben, for sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you so much for being here with us. We definitely appreciate it.
Well, Annie, I want to thank you for moderating this discussion and also thank the Freedom Center for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about American Ingrate. I really appreciate it.
Of course. And to our audience, one more time, go get yourself a copy of Ben's book, American Ingrate, Ilhan Omar and Progressive-Islamist Takeover of the Democratic Party. Ben, where can our audience get your book?
If you go to Amazon and type in American Ingrate, it's right there. You can also go to my website, benweingarten.com, and you'll see a banner for it right there as well. And I'd urge also everyone viewing this to subscribe to my newsletter for updates related to the book and also my other writings at the Federalist and work elsewhere. The URL there is bit.ly/BHW News. And you can find the book again at my website or on Amazon.
Fantastic. And to our audience, thank you so much for being with us. And remember, all of these extremely educational and important webinars are being brought to you for free by David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang. So if you like to support these webinars, consider making 100% tax-deductible donation by going to frontpagemag.com. Thank you so much, and we will see you soon.